Move now to the money desk. Devan Murugan joining us. Now, Devan, 3 months ago, the National Income Dynamic Study surveyed 7,000 people on how they were coping during the lockdown, February, March, April. Now, the second part of that study has come out, and I believe the picture's almost as bleak.
Yeah, very little changing, and this is 7,000 South Africans and how they were affected in the beginning of the year. Very little has changed. The second wave of that study, Sally, painting a frightening picture. Those same individuals targeted in the first study were now interviewed in the second wave. So I thought, let's get a sense from the principal investigator in that study, Dr. Nic Spaull, an economist from Stellenbosch University. Dr. Spaull, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. So this study covered vast areas, not just jobs, but I want to start with jobs. It's disheartening, to say the least, that your first study showed 2.8 million jobs were lost from February to April. Your new study shows almost none of those jobs had returned by the end of June.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the most concerning findings that we had, and one of the big questions was whether the jobs that were lost between February and April would have returned by June. So the move from level 5 lockdown to level 3. And unfortunately, the job losses that we see, which are actually quite similar in magnitude to what the QLFS data that Stats SA released yesterday showed, they reported 2.2 million job losses. And if those job losses persist, it will mean that we've lost a decade's worth of job creation because we've only created 2.4 million jobs in the last 10 years.
I mean, that's a startling picture indeed. In 4 months, we're losing as much jobs as we created in a decade. It speaks to the socio-economic status at the moment in the country. And I want to point out to the levels of hunger in the country amongst the poorest respondents. I mean, it was eye-catching in your first study. I see those levels have declined somewhat. One imagines that people are getting by with food, presumably from those government grants at play.
Yes, so I mean, one of the encouraging findings from the Wave 2 results was that hunger has come down from April until June. And this is almost certainly because of the rollout of the new government grant, as well as the top-ups to the old grants and the bounce back of furloughed workers. So half of those workers who didn't lose their job, but they lost their income. So they were put on sort of leave without pay. Half of them were re-employed by June, and we think that those are the three main reasons why hunger has come down by about 27%. So we see fewer households experiencing hunger and also running out of money to buy food. But the big question is what happens at the end of October when those grant top-ups are set to expire, and whether they're going to be prolonged or not.
And that's an interesting point, because the second study gave you a chance to really assess those grants, didn't you? There were a lot of questions around whether or not they would be effective, who's eligible for receiving them. What's the insight coming out from the second study? How effective have they been?
So the COVID-19 grant, the Social Relief of Distress grant, which is 350 Rand a month, you're only eligible for that grant if you haven't received any other grant or income. So that means that it's predominantly covering unemployed men, because a lot of women, poor women, have access to the child support grant if they have a child, which makes them ineligible for getting the SRD grant. And the paper by Tim Kohler and Haroon Borak shows that the receipt of this grant is quite pro-poor, in the sense that the people that are getting the grant are much more likely to be in the bottom half of the distribution, that it seems to be well targeted, and it is actually quite a phenomenal achievement that, again, we've managed to do in the last 4 months what took a decade before this. In the last 10 years, we've expanded the number of grants in South Africa by about 4 million. And we've now, so there are about 4 million SRD grant recipients in the last 4 months. And all of that was through digital verification and receipt. So no one was going to physical offices. So it's really quite a remarkable achievement.
Nick, your first study showed a disproportionate effect on women from the lockdown. They were the hardest hit in terms of jobs, pressures put on them with having to take care of children at home during the lockdown. What did the second wave of the study show in terms of their plight as the economy started to open up?
So we still see that women are between February and June. So over the whole period, women are still worse off than men in terms of they have lost more jobs than men have. However, there is a little bit of a gain between April and June for women and a little bit of a deterioration for men. But the overall picture is still that women are worse off than men. And one of the reasons for that, as you've mentioned, is the additional childcare responsibilities that they're likely to have while schools were closed. But one of the really concerning things is that early childhood development, we see about 1.5 million fewer children attending early childhood development centers, even though these centers are now legally allowed to be open and for them to operate. It turns out only a quarter of them have actually reopened. And there's a big question mark about whether the others are going to reopen or not, which has a big impact for women.
Indeed. And as I wrap up with you, there are businesses, there are labor, many parts of the social structure are watching what happens with an economic revival plan that we are hoping to hear from government soon, because that really is the key to economic growth in this country, to fix up some of the problems we're talking about here. Surely you have your eye on that as well.
Most definitely, and I think that economic growth is actually the big target that we're trying to work at, as well as jobs, public employment systems. But I don't think that they are. It's either grants or jobs. We probably need both of these things to get us out of the mess that we're in now. But yes, we are all looking to government to see what the next steps are, both in terms of grant as well as those job creation programs.
All right, to Dr. Nic Spaull from the Stellenbosch University. Thanks very much indeed.